Thank you very much, Anke, for coming to talk to us to Digit Debates. For everybody else from across the globe, it's fantastic to have you here, especially as we're in post-Brexit Britain. It's great to have our colleagues from the European Union. I think it's very important we continue having these dialogues with you. And we've got people from right across the world, so it's excellent to have you here. And welcome to Series 3, Episode 2, The Plot Deepens. Sorry, I mustn't say that anymore because I say that every time. We'd like to also thank the ESRC for funding this series, and our advisory board also commented recently that they thought this was a really great series, and I have to concur, obviously. And hopefully, we hoped the way we set it up that you will be able to get access to a lot of the materials that our speakers are basing their talks on. And if you go to the site today where Anke's talk is presented, you'll find some publications there that hopefully you'll find useful. We'll also draw attention at the end to an innovation fund projects we have announced that will be the deadline for applications is the 7th of June. And yeah, so let me introduce Anke. Anke, you're very welcome here to beautiful Brighton via Berlin. And Anke is a Professor of Public Policy at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. And you can read more about her on her short profile there on the website. And in particular, congratulations on just sending your book to OUP today. And it's a book on public policy in a new age. And I don't think there's been a time when possibly we've had more need to understand what, if anything, governments can do effectively to try and steer some of these issues that you're going to talk about in your talk. And I'm particularly looking forward to seeing the international comparisons of the UK and Germany and what that means for how we need to think about these things in terms of how they affect work. So Anke, over to you with no further ado. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for this kind introduction and for inviting me. I'm sharing my screen and I hope you can see it. Can you just sort of nod if you can see my screen? Yes, very good. Yes, and I'm delighted to be able to present my work here. This is work in progress. There are a couple of papers already sort of in manuscript forms and a couple of papers already submitted to journals. And if you go to our website, you will find all the papers that have been published in this project. And the project is funded by the German Ministry of Labour, and it deals with the transformation of work in the digital age. And this particular aspect, the case of Amazon and the case of e-commerce, started in a dialogue and a stakeholder dialogue that the ministry held about 2 years ago, when they invited different stakeholders, trade union representatives, but also the industry, both from the retail sector and the logistics sector and the e-commerce sector, to talk about the future of the industry. And what emerged pretty quickly was that the whole discussion was really around the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room was Amazon. And it turned out that all the other stakeholders, not just the trade unions, but also all the other retail companies, but also logistic companies, were really worried what was happening in the sector, to do with employment, to do with labor standards, to do with conditions, but also with their companies, in particular, how they could survive the competition from Amazon. And after we, and I was there as a researcher who wrote the report about the stakeholder dialogue, and afterwards the ministry commissioned us with a project to look more into this and really ask the question, what is the effect of Amazon on the German labor market in these industries? And that is when we started working on platform firms and the restructuring of work. And what I will do now is I will talk a little bit about our more theoretical understanding of the nature of platform firms and what they mean. And a lot of you will probably already be familiar with that, and I'll try to cover that rather quickly. But we do have a sort of understanding of how we conceptualize platform firms and their effects. Then I will talk about the case of Amazon, and in particular about these different case studies in the UK, the US, and Germany, and how they differ and why we think they differ. And finally, I will talk a little bit about the implications, policy implications, and what we can learn, both from understanding the platform economy in general, but also from the Amazon case. So starting with platform firms and the digital economy, I would just like to start off this conversation by highlighting the role of the digital economy, and that is not surprising to any of you. If you look at the value added of the real economy, and if you look at the share of the digital economy, you see that the digital economy has been outpacing the real economy quite substantially, and particularly substantially before the financial crisis. If you look at the rates for 2006 and 2007, where you had sort of the growth rate was 5 times in the digital economy. These are US data compared to the rest of the economy, and it has declined somewhat after the financial crisis. But if you look at the data from 2015, and I'm sure if we had newer data, we could see that the digital economy is really outpacing the real economy at a very fast rate. We can also look at the role of tech companies, and when we look at their market capitalization, and this is a graph which comes from the Financial Times, which looks at market capitalization of tech firms compared to other firms. And these are the top 10 tech groups. And if you look at the market capitalization of these firms, you see that they are 2.5 times the size of the leading 10 global banks. And this is the second group. So the tech companies have really outreached and outpaced the other sectors tremendously. And I'll show you another table where you can see this process. Again, this doesn't come to a surprise for many of you. And this is just a comparison of market capitalization of top firms globally in 2 points of time. The first one is in the year 2000, and the second one is in the year 2020. And where you see that in 2000, if we look at the top 10 global firms, we see that this is a mixture of different kinds of firms. You have very generic firms like General Electric, you have technology firms. At this time, that was Microsoft, and Microsoft wasn't even the biggest one. Cisco was bigger than Microsoft at the time. You have oil companies, you have pharmaceutical companies, retail companies, and banks. So you have a very mixed picture if you look at the biggest global firms, 10 global firms in 2000, and that is only 20 years ago. But if you look at the biggest firms in 2020, you see that out of the 10 largest firms, 7 of them are tech companies. And of these 7, 5 are American tech companies and 2 are Chinese tech companies, Alibaba and Tencent. And if you look at the rate of market capitalization and you compare that with the companies 20 years ago, you see they also are much larger than before. If you look at the sort of bottom of these global top 10, where you still have Johnson & Johnson and Visa, for instance, they have grown compared to the top to the bottom 2 20 years ago, but not massively. But if you look at the difference between General Electric and Microsoft, you see that this is actually quite a large difference. So these tech companies have grown in importance, they have grown in market capitalization, in financial power, and also in investment. And if you look more closely at these top 7 firms, or the top 5 American firms, you look at Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Apple, you see that these are also the leading platform companies. The community or the ecosystem of platform companies is very much split between US firms and Chinese firms. And this is just a bigger graph which takes into account more companies. But again, you see the dominance of the big 5 American firms, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Alphabet, and Amazon on the one hand, and in Asia or in China, you see Tencent and Alibaba, but you also see very clearly that the share of platform companies in Europe is very small, and there's really only one company which plays a role at all. That is SAP in Germany, which produces business software. You have Spotify as one meaningful platform company in Europe as well, but already Wirecard is not on there anymore. So it is really a market which is very much dominated by US firms and to some extent by Chinese firms. And if we look at the discussion over the last year or so, we also see that there's a growing concern about the rise of the power of the tech companies in various aspects. And we see that when we look at the papers, when we look at various pushbacks, political pushbacks. And here's a pushback by the EU against Amazon. And the complaint against Amazon at the EU level is about the abuse of market power. And the abuse of market power is to say that Amazon forces the participants in Amazon Marketplace to use Amazon logistics. And it is also the abuse of market dominance, that Amazon actually knows what is listed on its own platform, and Amazon can present its own products in a more preferential light. It also can use price arbitrage to make sure that customers use their own products vis-a-vis other people's products. So this is not a fair competition anymore. And the complaint at the EU level was that Amazon has to be looked at in terms of competition policy. So there is a political pushback. The other political pushback is also, if you look at Google, but what is interesting is to see how Amazon also reaches into other domains and other aspects at other industries. For instance, Amazon is not only running its marketplace, but Amazon is also launching, or has launched, its own pharmacy delivery service for prescription and medications. And I will come back to that in a moment, because I think that is an important development. So this is just a very general introduction into the role and the rising powers of tech companies and how they have been set up. So how can we understand the role of tech companies, and what kind of service do they actually deliver, and how can we understand them a little bit better? And there are various explanations or various approaches of how we can look at the role of tech companies in terms of the different services they offer. So one way to look at it is really to look at the technological side. And there the argument is that what tech companies do is really they provide general purpose technology. And this general purpose technology is structuring the internet and the digital age in the way we use it. So you get very universal use of various services, of messaging services, of banking services, of communication services, but also of transportation services. So the focus there, when we try to look at tech companies and what they do, is really to focus on the provision of technology as a general purpose technology. The second way to look at what tech companies do is actually to perceive them more as public utilities. And this is an argument that was made very much by Elizabeth Warren in the election campaign, to say we really have to regulate tech companies in the same way that we regulate utilities. And utilities are service providers, just like water, just like electricity, just like waste collection. And you have there a certain set of rules of what public utilities or what utilities companies actually have to do, how they have to deliver and serve every citizen in a community at a reasonable price and with a reasonable service. So we can look at tech companies also in their functions and what the role they play in society as a public utility. The third way to look at them is really to understand them as utility networks. And that is what a lot of not only lawyers, but also competition economists started to argue, is to say that we really have to understand much better the network component and the network quality and network effects of platform firms, and what that means for other market participants. So this is really a comparison of the services of tech companies is with, for instance, railway networks, but also electricity networks, but also cable networks, because there in all of these services, we have network effects. And I will say a little bit more about network effects and why they're important when we try to understand platform firms. And the last aspect, and it's all the last way we can understand platform firms is really as trying to understand them as critical infrastructure. And critical infrastructure is just any kind of infrastructure that is important for business and society, and without which we could not really run our daily businesses anymore and could not live our daily lives anymore. So critical infrastructure is transportation, but also electricity, and telecommunication in many countries is already seen as a critical infrastructure. but the services by tech companies is not yet seen as a critical infrastructure. And I'm pretty sure that will come soon, that we have to take into account what that means if we understand platform companies also as critical infrastructure. So to what extent, and one way, one aspect here is to say, these are different takes of what platform firms do. And what we can say is really that they are all these things. So the services that are provided by platform companies and by big tech companies are really, they provide general purpose technology. They are in a way and are acting in a way like public utilities. They are utility networks, but they're also critical infrastructure. So they really combine components of all these different perspectives. And this is why, and because they can do that, this is why they are so powerful. And this is why they can dominate the market so much. And one of the more important aspects of it is really the aspect of utility networks. And when we talk about utility networks, we talk about network effects, and we can see that there are direct and indirect network effects of tech companies. And the direct effects are really the economies of scale, the increasing trend toward the monopolization of the market, the growing marginal benefits, and the declining marginal costs. And this is intuitively very easy to understand if we think about a company like Amazon Marketplace. Obviously, the company becomes much more powerful the more people use it, and people tend to use it even more when they know that all the products they're looking for are basically listed on Amazon. And the same is true for Facebook or Twitter or other social media companies. We know that the more people are active on Facebook, the more interesting it becomes, because there's no point to be in a network or a social media site when no one else is there. So you want to be where the majority of people are, and that leads to monopolization. But with the direct effect of growing marginal benefits, we also have indirect effects. And these indirect effects are that if you have a company that is dominating the market, then this company can basically also set the standards, the technical specification, but it also can regulate the access, and it also can regulate the participation in the network. And that is what Martin Kenny talked about when he talks about platform firms as private regulators. It is completely under the control of Amazon, of who can actually list their products on the Amazon website. And Amazon can delist any product it wants. It can specify the terms and conditions with which other people, third parties, vendors can use its facilities. And it is in complete control of that. So it is really a standard setter, and it can force everyone else to comply with the rules that are set by Amazon. So utility networks is a powerful aspect of platform firms, and they make them, they give them a lot of leverage. The second aspect is that there is a particular relationship between the infrastructure aspect of tech companies and the role of sectoral platforms. And this is based on work from Josie van Dijk, who has already, she's a sort of media expert, but she has really done a lot of interesting work on platforms. And she has really made the distinction. Annabel Goer is another a scholar who uses a similar language, but slightly different language. But one should really distinguish between the two sides of platforms. And these are the two sides are infrastructure on the one hand and sectoral platforms on the other hand. And infrastructure platforms, this is more towards the utility network. This is how the internet is provided. This is the structuring of the internet. This includes, for instance, the use of search engines. We could not use the internet at all if there was no search engine, if there was no Google or Bing or any other search engine that would actually links us or leads the way to finding other websites. But other aspects of the infrastructure also has to do with clouds, it has to do with messaging services, it has to do with payment systems, etc. This is the infrastructure we need and we increasingly use, and we probably cannot live without anymore if this infrastructure wasn't provided. But on top, and Josie van Dijk sort of uses this image as a tree, that this is really the sort of the roots of the tree of the digital economy. But there's also another part of the digital economy, and this is these are sectoral platforms. And this is really how platform companies can use their power and their control over infrastructure to develop sectoral platforms which then compete with traditional industries. And if you look at Uber, for instance, competing with taxi transportation, we look at Airbnb, which sets up a business that competes with established hotel industries. We look at Amazon in the retail and logistics industry, et cetera, et cetera. And it is really the combination and the control over these two different wings of platform firms, the infrastructure platforms and the sectoral platforms, that then gives a lot of competitive edge and competitive leverage to platform firms that then start competing in traditional markets. So tech companies own infrastructure and sectoral platforms, and all the big American tech companies own both parts of it to different extents. They do not all do the same thing, but they all own both infrastructure and sectoral platforms, and they all engage in private regulation. They all have dependent entrepreneurs, and these are the entrepreneurs that are using these platforms in order to make a business, either as an Uber driver or as a vendor on Amazon Marketplace. And they determine very one-sided rules for participation, of ratings, of robo-firing, of accessing these platforms. And they use the data that they can generate from the platform to exploit the market. And they can do that either for pricing, and we see that when we look at Marketplace, but they can also do that when they want to set up logistics, because they know Amazon, for instance, knows exactly what is sold in which place, which product is sent from A to B at what moment in time. And based on this data, they can make forecasts that they know, if last Christmas, so many pieces of biscuits were sold in Brighton, for instance, they can pretty much estimate that next year there will be a similar business going on, and they can make forecasts and they can anticipate traffic on their side, and they can also anticipate the logistics that is needed to make these sales happen. So it is the combination between the infrastructure platform and the sectoral platform that really makes it a challenge, but also a threat really for companies that are not tech companies and that are operating in traditional industries such as the logistics industry, but also the hotel industry and the retail industry, for instance. So what does it have to do with work? How does it affect work? If you think about the process of virtualization of work, for instance, that David Weil has introduced, if you think about the transition from the vertically integrated firm that we know from 50 years ago, when we were still in a system where firms were pretty much structured, pretty much integrated, and provided pretty much standard employment. And if we look at the transition of the integrated firm to a firm that was based much more on a nexus of contract system, where you get where companies started using very complex subcontracting schemes, and where companies try to get rid of more and more responsibility vis-a-vis workers and started to divide companies more in the core workforce, which still had standard employment, and a peripheral workforce, which was much more at the fringe of the company, and increasing dualization at the company, at the firm level. So what we see now with the rise of the tech companies and the rise of platform firms is that in addition, you have much more platform-based work. And the kind of platform-based work we know is obviously in the gig economy and in gig work, where you have task-based work, and this is sort of developing, or has been developing over the last 10 years, as one aspect and one area of new and emerging work. And what we see is that this is a further push towards liberalization, a further push towards more self-employment, to lower pay and more insecure working hours. And what we see is in the combination of having, because, when we then look at platform firms, what they do is they have all these components. So platform firms and tech companies have one component, which is still the integrated firm. And these are the aspects for software engineer and highly productive and highly valuable workers in that firm. So we do have standard employment also in platform firms, but then they engage in much more complex subcontracting exercises. And this is based on the data they have and based on the predicted sales they can make. And in addition to that, they have started to experiment with platform-based work, and the combination and interaction between subcontracting and platform-based work is something we can then see or understand as the super fishering of work. So we have a trend towards fishering, but this makes it even more precarious. So this is the sort of more conceptual understanding of how we try to understand what is happening with Amazon and what is happening with the effect of Amazon in particular in the logistics sector. So we did, and I will now talk a little bit about the case of Amazon and what we learned when we started studying the case of Amazon. And what we did is we did 3 case studies in the US, Germany, and the UK, in particular with regard to the logistics sector, because we wanted to understand what does it mean when Amazon is not only the platform that allows third-party vendors to sell their products on Amazon and they facilitate the sale. But what Amazon did pretty much early on is started to get into logistics itself. And oops. And the Amazon case is a case which we also know pretty well. Amazon started in the mid 1990s, so not that long ago, and it is a very fast growing company. It has a huge product range. It has infrastructure, and by the way, the biggest part of Amazon does not come from marketplace, but the biggest part of Amazon comes from its cloud business, and that is also the most profitable part of the Amazon business is the cloud business. But here I want to look at the retail aspect and the e-commerce aspect of Amazon and how it has started to use the logistics and what does that mean for the logistics sector in these countries we looked at. So I don't know why it's jumping, but so this is just a quote from Jeff Bezos, which is, however, I think important to keep in mind that for Jeff Bezos from the very beginning, the aim was to build the world's most customer-centric company. And this is part of the mission statement of Amazon still, and the customer orientation and the pursuit of customer satisfaction is still very much at the heart of Amazon. And if you look at the retail sector and the e-commerce sector, and what does that mean? For the e-commerce sector, that means that there's a very clear priority for low prices, for fast delivery, and for good services. And that is how Jeff Bezos tries to attract more and more customers around the world. Amazon Marketplace is a platform-based e-commerce business. It is reaching into the logistics side as well. So Amazon does not have to do the logistics by itself. Amazon could just operate as a platform and let people use the platform to sell their own products, but also to sell its own products. But this is not how Amazon Logistics works. Amazon Logistics is pretty much also logistics-based, that it tries to cover the logistics in the sector itself and also take over the logistics and also try to tie people into the logistics by Amazon. And what that means is that on the one hand, you have a platform firm and you have a platform business model, but on the other hand, you have a logistics side of it. And the combination of the logistics side is a combination of subcontracting, contracting, but also platform-based work. And this is just an overview, and that is something we do not have to dwell on. We all know how Amazon has been growing over the last 5 years or so, and in the pandemic, Amazon has exploded. And I don't have data for the most recent data, but it is important to keep that in mind, that the pandemic obviously boosted the sales of Amazon products tremendously. It also shows the countries where Amazon is focusing on. This is obviously the United States, where still more than 2/3 of its business and sales is taking place. But the second biggest country is Germany, and that is immediately followed by the UK, and then then there's Japan and the rest of the world, so all other countries combined is following suit. But so the three countries, United States, Germany, and the UK, are the three major countries where Amazon is operating. So Amazon Logistics, in order to understand it, it is important that Amazon Logistics did not lose control over the logistics sides of its business, but it is active in the entire B2C, business to consumers logistics value chain. So it has control over all these aspects. And the most challenging part of the logistics side is the last mile delivery, and where it is still pretty much dependent on human labor. So there is not much of autonomous delivery yet, although they are experimenting with autonomous deliveries, and they're experimenting also with drones. But Amazon tests various employment models and business models on how to organize, in particular, logistics in the last mile. And the ways to do that is, one is Amazon Flex, and Amazon Flex is a business model where an individual worker can just apply for it, can work up to 4 hours a day if they have a car, and the car has to have 4 doors. And then if they have a car, if they have a driver's license, they can register with Amazon Flex, and they can then sign up to shifts and deliver parcels wherever they are. So this is really a platform-based business model, where you have, a bit like Uber, where you have to bring your own vehicle. The second employment model that is also facilitated and advertised by Amazon is Amazon Delivery Service Partners. And this is really a way of getting a small entrepreneur to be responsible for several vans and hiring several either business partners or employees who drive these parcels and deliver the parcels and do the last mile logistics also for Amazon. And Amazon is giving loans and facilitating the vans and facilitating the networks. And the third way of carrying out the logistics is to have a classic subcontracting business via small and medium-sized companies. So all three employment models are used by Amazon, but to various degrees. And what we have found when we looked at the different models is what matters, and this is where these three case studies come in. What matters is really what kind of competition you already have in the logistics sector. So how concentrated is the logistics sector? And what is also of importance is what is the role of the former state-run mail service provider, which in all these countries we used to have the Royal Mail on the one hand, Deutsche Post in the German case, we had former state-run mail service providers. And their role in the logistics market is still critical to show how much Amazon can move their own mail logistics provision into the market. But what is also important, and that is something we also found in the case studies, is that the regulation of self-employment and access to social insurance for the self-employed makes a big difference for people, whether they are tempted or incentivized to actually take out the offer by Amazon to become their driver, either as a self-employed or as a business partner. And also the regulation of subcontracting obviously is important to understand what is happening there. So when we did the case studies, what we found in the US is that we had a pretty high market concentration in the logistics sector. We still had a dominating role of USPS, the former state-run mail provider, but this has been diminished over time. We found that there was an increase in self-employment, in particular of couriers and messengers, but this increase was actually not so big. We did not really find a lot of increase in independent contracting. On the contrary, it decreased a little bit. And we had a slight increase of couriers and messenger occupation also in a period of 10 years. And we use the data, and that is something I should say in the beginning, doing research on Amazon is not easy because there's no easily available data in what you can use, either employment data, but also in operations in different facilities, whether it's fulfillment centers or distribution centers, you cannot really you do not really get access to it. So what we try to use is to find a proxy, and the proxy is really the rate of self-employment, either overall in the overall economy or self-employment in the courier and messenger sector, and to see do we find a further dissemination of more precarious and more self-employed work, in particular in the logistics sector. And how has the logistics sector changed over time with the entry of Amazon into the market? So in the US, we find, due to the fact that USPS is still a dominant force, due to the fact that the market is actually relatively concentrated, we only find a sort of slight increase in self-employment in logistics in the US. In Germany, we also find a market which is highly concentrated. We have the old Deutsche Post, which is now called DPDHL, as a dominating company. We have other competitors, UPS, DPD, GLS. So there are other logistics companies which are in the market. These smaller competitors have already started subcontracting, using subcontracting in order to compete with DPDHL. And DPDHL, because it is a former state-run company, it still has better paid jobs, and it still can outcompete with other companies like Hermes and DPD because they offer better employment conditions. What we find is that self-employment has not been increasing, but actually has been decreasing. So there's not really a take-up of offers by Amazon to start to drive for Amazon as a self-employed. In particular, couriers and messengers are not really moving towards more self-employment, but they are employed either directly by subcontractors, and only some of them, or the minority of them, are self-employed. And the third case we looked at is the UK, and the UK is actually quite different from the other two markets in the sense that in the UK you have a much lower market concentration when it comes to logistics. The competition in the logistics sector is much fiercer. We found 16 firms which are all relevant in the logistics market, and we have Royal Mail as, again, the former state-run service providers, which, however, through to privatization has a much more diminished role and is not really the standard setter in the sector anymore. And the employment in the UK in the logistics sector is more insecure compared to the other countries, and we find much more outsourcing, and we also find the subcontracting is more widely disseminated also compared to the other countries. But in particular, we find an increase in self-employment, and this is an increase overall on the entire UK labour market. And we found a particular strong increase in self-employment in this segment in the logistics sector of couriers and messengers. And I just show you the data we found on self-employment, and this is just self-employment in the entire economy as a part of employment. And if you look at the gray line, you find the UK, and the UK, you have a steady increase in self-employed to up to almost 16% now. If you look at the German numbers, we find they are, or they used to be 15 years ago, almost at the UK level, but since then self-employment in Germany has been declining, and that has to do with a booming labor market where people just sort of chose to not to go into self-employment. And the US, the US data is a little bit more complicated, but anyway, the trend is in the US that there is no increase in self-employment at all over that period. And if we look more specifically at self-employment in the couriers and messenger occupations, And we see again in the UK, we see a strong increase, in particular over the last 10 years. We see a slight increase in the US, and here the US now has higher numbers than Germany, and in Germany we see declining numbers. So there are actually quite different pictures in how the logistics sector has become more insecure and more precarious. And that leaves me to show you this picture. And this picture, you know, you're all familiar with that, is the film Sorry, We Missed You, which sort of, you know, shows pretty well the story of employment in the logistics sector in the UK, and as very precarious work. So I'm running out of time, and I just want to, I'm not saying much about COVID because, you know, we all know how COVID has sort of boosted the Amazon business. But I want to highlight in the COVID effect is really different kinds of labor market policies, and different kinds of labor market policies. The short-time work scheme in Germany, in the US you had the Paycheck Protection Program, in the UK you had the Job Retention Scheme, and our hunch is that it really matters what kind of labor market protection scheme you had during the COVID crisis, when it comes to how Amazon could sort of, on what terms Amazon could sort of expand its business during the pandemic. And maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. So the conclusion on Amazon is is really that, you know, over time you had actually a slight upgrading of employment relations in the logistics sector before COVID-19. But we find very different situations in these three countries we studied. And in particular, when we look at the role of self-employment and how self-employment is used in the logistics sector, and we found that of these three countries, and that is probably not so surprising, that the German industrial relations system was most resilient, and that the German government was also more willing to intervene and to introduce some protective policies in order to protect people in the low-paid logistics sector. I want to finish because I'm running out of time. I just want to say two more very broad conclusions on the impact of platform firms on work. And the one aspect I want to highlight is the aspect which I sort of try to explain in the more conceptual section, which says that, you know, platform firms create new work practices, not just in the gig economy, but also in established industries. And they can do that by forcing more competition and heightened competition and new work models in other sectors. And these other sectors, and I talked about logistics, this is one example for it, but we can also look at other industries where we can study these developments in the hotel industry, but also we can study the role of media when it comes to social media, how, you know, the terms and conditions in journalism, for instance, has changed with the rise of social media. But we can also look at the example of the pharmacies, when Amazon started offering pharmacies and drugs, prescriptive drugs, for instance. So there is an indirect effect on working conditions in other traditional industries, which are not directly platform run. So that is my first broad conclusion. And the second broad conclusion is really is to do with the factors we found when we looked at how these labor markets, these specific labor markets in the logistics sector were affected by the increase of Amazon, is that what we found as factors, context factors, is the competition in the industry makes a difference. The regulation of subcontracting, the use of subcontracting makes it different, but also the welfare state context makes a difference. So access to healthcare in the UK, for instance, is important and makes it more attractive for people to be self-employed because they have free access to healthcare, which they do not have in the US or in Germany. But also the role of the employment status, and this is sort of just a hint at the Uber case in the Supreme Court, and what does it mean to have an employment status as someone who works on a platform, but also the role of state pensions, for instance. How universal are state pensions? How easy is it to access state pension? Makes a difference and facilitate some kind of self-employment and more insecure working practices, which then disseminate more easily if you have these welfare state provisions in place. So, and this is it from my side. And I would like to thank you for listening. I'm sorry I went over time a little bit.
Thank you, Anke. That was fantastic. Really comprehensive presentation. I think what was particularly interesting was the linking up to how these platforms relate to the digital infrastructures on so many levels, as well as what implications it has for different patterns of employment. Now, I'd like to invite questions from the audience. You're very welcome, as I said, to put them in the chat or to raise your hands. I know there are some people here from the Independent Workers of Great Britain, so please feel free if you've got a question that you'd like to ask in relation to some of these issues around what's been happening of the regulation of gig workers and delivery workers. Right, anybody, before I launch in with my questions, let's see if anybody else first of all would like to ask one. No hands going up, no questions in the chat. Right. Oh, Slato, would you like to go ahead, and could you also introduce yourself, where you're from briefly, and can we have some quick questions, and then it's Valeria and then Simon. Excellent, thanks.
Hello, I'm Zlatko from the University of Leeds, and I'm very interested in digital transformation and sustainability. And first of all, thank you very much for this great presentation. I was really impressed. And my question is, I always see the development of firms and then the development of the state and public policy as kind of co-evolutionary processes. So they affect each other. So we had the rise of these giant tech firms. How do you see the evolution of the state and public policy? In particular, if you look at the differences regarding the UK and Germany, is Germany reacting? I mean, you mentioned that already, but could you elaborate on that a bit more? Thank you.
Could I just collect two other questions to make sure we get as many as possible? Okay, Simon, Joyce, and then Valeria. And could you introduce yourself very briefly?
Yeah, Simon Joyce, Digit Research Fellow at the University of Leeds. I've actually got two questions. Well, one quick one. Just in terms of the UK self-employment in the logistics sector, like the last mile delivery and so on. I mean, as your graph showed, that really started before Amazon's big impact in Britain. So it's kind of like they're following. There was experimentation with the logistics companies with forms of self-contracting, and then they have problems with that and move more towards straightforward platformization. Kind of Amazon, if anything, are kind of following that. I mean, okay, they've got their own development. So it looks like that's something British rather than something Amazon, but maybe you've got thoughts on that. Question I was going to ask you about was network effects, because I just wondered if you'd kind of investigated or problematized those at all, because it's a phrase that gets used a lot, but it's not ever so clear what exactly those are. I mean, in the economics literature, as I understand it, it's distinguished from economies of scale, because it's not about production, it's about demand side, market side. It's come from economics. I've got a friend who's a mathematician of networks, and he's never heard of network effects. So it's something that's come from free market economics. And if you think about Facebook, well, Facebook now has more competitors than it had before. If you think about, so it's not, you know, it started off as a monopoly, and now it's not. Uber in like mini cabs, there's no case anywhere in the world of taxi firms monopolizing. They're almost always localized, so it's very difficult to see a network effect on that. So but on the other hand, there obviously is something about being first movers and being big monopolies and doing things differently. I just wondered if you kind of unpicked, because there's obviously something going on there, but I just wonder if the claims that are made by some of the economics papers are quite as straightforward as they're claimed to be. So that's it.
Anke, would you like to answer those two, or shall I just collect two more? Would you like to have a flood of questions to make sure as many people can speak as possible?
Yeah, you can collect more.
Okay.
I mean, so these are two. These are really good questions.
Big, chunky ones. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I just like to get as many voices as possible. Valeria, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question, please? And then Adrash, if you'd like to ask it as well, then we'll go back to Anke.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jackie, and nice to see Anke. Very interesting presentation. Thank you very much, Anke. I just wanted to, a very short question that you started to tackle at the end of your presentation when you looked in particularly around the kind of institutional context. I was just wondering whether these kind of changes that you have highlighted, particularly, the rise of these globally network kind of companies or platform work combinations, whatever we want to call it, how would you see this kind of transformation? So what are the implications of this for the kind of argument that Wolfgang Streeck made about the beneficial constraints? I mean, could we argue that this sort of, business might be generally less patient in adapting to long-term beneficial constraints? Or do we see something completely different? So I'm quite interested in trying to see whether we can make sense of the argument of Streeck in these new transformations and how in this new transformation that you have kind of highlighted in a quite interesting way. Thank you very much.
Okay, I've got a flood of other questions coming in now. I did say Adrash could ask his. But Anke, would you like to take his first three, because there are actually quite a lot there before Adrash, and then I've got Tim Marsh.
Okay, shall I?
Adrash, can we just wait 1 minute? There's quite a lot she's had there, so just give her a chance to at least respond to them, and then I'll come to yourself and then to Tim Marsh if you want to ask your question.
Yes, these are all great questions. It's not about the sort of co-evolution between of public policies and corporate strategies. I completely agree, and I think what we see now is sort of 10 years after the rise of tech companies is now a pushback by public policies, and you see that in all countries. You see it in the US, where Congress, House of Representatives had its big report about market abuse, market power of tech companies, how to rein in tech companies, and there will be regulations of them, and there will be public policies. I'm pretty sure, there will be a flood of public policy trying to address these issues, because it has now reached a point where people are seriously worried about competition policies and monopolization and domination of these companies. Certainly in the industries they're active in, but also in politics. So Amazon is the biggest lobbyist in Washington, and there are sort of certain effects that policymakers are becoming really seriously worried about, and there will be public policy. And I think the two areas where we already see it, we see it in competition policy, we see it from the EU. The European Commission has now published its proposal on the Digital Market Acts, the Digital Services Act. So there are a number of sort of proposals already on the table on how to do that. Individual member states, I'm not so sure about the UK, but certainly Germany has already sort of changed its competition law to take into account that it is not really a welfare effect that sort of is used as a definition of a dominant position of a firm in the market, but it is really a much wider definition of, and they've done that in order to be able to address tech companies and their market position and try to combat their market position. So competition policy is really on the agenda, and there will be many more sort of initiatives in competition policies by policymakers. And the other aspect is I think, is employment policies. And we see that when it comes to the gig economy, and we see it in all European countries, all governments sort of develop pretty different responses to the gig economy, and to, you know, some do it via courts, some do it via employment legislation, some regulate companies to adopt certain business models. So there's a lot of public policy that is already very active in trying to regulate these industries and these companies. So I think it's not so much a co-evolution. It's really sort of these companies have exploited loopholes or created new niches for their businesses, and policymakers are now responding, and the response is now coming in, and we will see, and it's a lot of contestation. So we wrote this paper about sort of contested terrains and about contestation and policy making around tech companies. So this is the first question. Simon, your questions are really interesting, and it is not that Amazon introduced subcontracting in the logistics sector, and because, as you said, in all these countries, subcontracting has been happening for the last 30 years in many industries, and also in the logistics industries, and it has been happening to different extent depending. And I think the former sort of big mail provider, it sort of plays a role to what extent the former Royal Mail or Deutsche Post is really a standard setter or not. That really makes a difference, whether they can actually control the employment standards in the industry. And other smaller private competitors have started subcontracting earlier, but what Amazon does is obviously they push it further and they add another component, and the other component, the new component, is really try to systematically try out forms of self-employment, which wasn't really so much in the industry before. I think that is and by increasing the competition and pressure in the industry, they force also their business partners and the countries they commission to do logistics for them to try out these new employment patterns in order to cut costs. So I think that is the effect of Amazon. So they didn't start outsourcing. The network effect, as you're right, and the network effect comes from a discussion in industrial economics. And it really shows that it is an effect that if you have a network effect that with increasing participants in the network, you get a decrease in marginal cost. So it's not economies of scale, but it's really that participants are locked into the network and have to decide on one standard over the other standard. So if you have and the example is always the railway system. You cannot have a railway system with different standards where each railway company sort of lays down its own tracks. This is not working. And once you have laid down the tracks, every company who's using these tracks have to converge on the systems of the railway tracks and is bound into the system. And has to use the system and has to use the tracks as they were laid before. So they're really sort of bound to an infrastructure, which is then sort of becoming more efficient the more participants you have. The more people use the tracks, the more efficient the system is. And the question about the monopolizing is an interesting one, because you're right. Uber is not the only transportation company in town. There's competition in that area too, and people try to enter the market, and there are different competing companies who want to use the business model and who are working on the best software on how to use it. And I think it all depends on the venture capital who is trying to make a bet on a particular company and is giving a lot of money to a particular company in order to build up a competitor to Uber or not. So if you are a startup company and you have an idea and you say, I can actually be better than Uber because I have a better software, and you find a venture capitalist who gives you the money to sort of to build up this business, you also get competition. The problem with that is, though, that a lot of tech companies try to avoid that and try to sort of buy up the startup companies beforehand, before they get to the market and before they can sort of establish some competition in the industry. So I think competition is sort of to some extent manufactured by venture capitalists making strategic choices in who to back with what kind of money, because they think, you know, this is the better model, and that might sort of outcompete Uber, and Uber might not only be a sort of transitory phenomenon and might not last in the long run, as all these food couriers might not last in the long run, because none of them actually make money. You know, all of these companies do not make money, but they sort of burn the money of venture capitalists to sort of try out the software and try out a new business model. So I think network so my answer to that is network effects are real, but secondly, that does not mean that sort of for a period of time you have more than 2 or 3 more competitors in the market, but you know, you don't know which one of them will survive. Valeria, on the beneficial constraints is an interesting question, because I wouldn't even think of constraining beneficial constraints in this context, but because obviously the companies, they are building markets and they're building business models, and they're trying everything they can to get rid of constraints and not to comply to any constraints. And we know that these tech companies are all rule breakers, you know, and they try to break the rules as long as they can until courts force them to implement some rules or accept some rules. But they certainly don't believe in beneficial constraints. You know, they're the opposite of that. But you could also say that even in the heydays of Fordist production, you know, the companies themselves did not necessarily believe in beneficial constraints, or they did not necessarily subscribe to them. They had to accept them because they were there, and they were looking for ways around it. And the beneficial side of beneficial constraints is really that, you know, they tried to work with the workforce they had, because they could not easily get rid of them, and the workforce had actually quite a say in the workplace. So I think as long as there are no strong rules for tech companies and strong institutions over, you know, what they can do and what they can't do, and as strong as sort of it still pays off to break the rules, you know, it's very hard to see how beneficial constraints can come in there.
Could I I know we've gone over time slightly. There are 3 more questions that I would like to include. I know some people obviously have to go now. Join us again next week. The debate continues. But could I just bring in the last 3 people who'd like to ask a question, which is Adash, Tim Marsh and Rachel Verdin. So if you would like to briefly ask a question and introduce yourself, and then, is that okay, Anke? I'm not wearing you out.
No.
Yeah, you're a resilient young woman, because you're also part of the German system. There you go. Resilient trade unions, as we heard. Right, over to Adash.
Thanks, Jacqueline, for providing the time, and thanks, Hassel, for this nice talk. And without taking any time, I just want to ask, like, how do we see how we understand the well-being of the workers? Like over the time, we have seen that there has been a over the time, I personally am experiencing as a gig worker that there has been so much of stress. There is but that has to be journalized. That has to be put forward to the world. And then how should we address it, and what methodologies can be adopted? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to collect a bunch of 3. So Tim Marsh, would you like to open your mic and ask your question? Thanks, Tim.
Sure. Okay, thanks. Sorry, I have to run in a minute as well, so I'll be quick. My name's Tim. I work for the IWGB trade union for the couriers and logistics branch. My question was just around, in the UK, we see a lot of the workers multi-app. That is, they work for lots of different competing platforms. You'll find that Deliveroo essentially has the same workforce as Uber Eats. They pick and choose depending on who they think is providing their fees or whatever on a day-to-day basis. You even see that between industries as well. A lot of Uber drivers at the beginning of the pandemic moved over to Uber Eats. We saw many more cars in London, for example. I was just wondering to what extent that happened in other countries as well. I mean, presumably maybe in Germany, because of the lower prevalence of self-employment, that was less of the case.
Let Anke answer that, but definitely in America, you see people working for Uber and Lyft in the same car. But the very last question is from Rachel Verdin, and then I'll hand over to Anke to wrap it all up. Thank you very much.
Hi, yeah, it was just a quick one. That was really fascinating. Thank you. I just wanted to know if you could just perhaps explain a little bit about what the situation is in terms of unionisation in Germany. In the UK, we've seen some kind of new unions emerging to sort of address the challenge of platform work, and in the US recently, they've obviously they had that vote around the unionisation of that Amazon depot, and there were fairly high profile people kind of getting involved, Biden included. So I just wanted to know what the situation was in Germany, whether they are in unions, are they new kind of unions, and if they've kind of had any successes or what obstacles they might face. Thank you.
Yes.
Anke, fire ahead. You've got the
word. Very quickly, Adarsh, well-being of workers, obviously all these struggles that are fought at the moment are fought either in the courts. I mean, and as you know, that the UK is very active on that, to try to get the employment status to gig workers, and you find that in a lot of countries. In other countries, you find, in particular in the Nordic countries, we now have sort of trade unions that negotiate collective agreements for gig workers, which is a different approach, but which is obviously only possible if you are in a Nordic system where, you know, the unions actually have a say in these industries. But I think when sort of directly from a worker's perspective, and in the public sort of in the protest sort of you're already organizing, I think to come to a situation to define gig work as work and as employment is actually a big step and an important step, and sort of and there's a tension in the industry because a lot of people also value the freedom that they have, and you know there are always reports, I don't know whether it's the same in the UK, but here definitely that sort of gig workers say, you know, they actually don't mind being self-employed because they have, you know, there are certain benefits attached to that, and they don't want to work a shift. They want to have their sort of flexibility in working time schedules, etc., etc. So there's also a pushback to that, but I do think that sort of having a clear employment status is important because it forces employers to bear a certain amount of responsibility, and that should be what the struggle should be about, sort of to really sort of get to the point that it is clear that this is an employment relationship and nothing else. And even if it's a very flexible one, I think this is an important strategic goal to have. In terms of multi-apps, I know it from the UK, from the US, and I'm pretty sure it also happens here. So in the German context, that people have different apps and use different apps because there's no reason why not to do that, unless you really have sort of people who are employed and they, if, for instance, Uber is it does not really rely only on self-employed workers, but has to hire workers as employed, and then it becomes more difficult to do that. So I think there is a you see again the tension, sort of the more employment regulation you get in the gig economy and for gig workers, the less flexible it is also for the worker side, and the less multi-apping is actually possible in a system where you have more employment rights for gig workers. And I think there's a trade-off there. In terms of unionization, it is not so much, I saw it in the UK, that there are new unions sort of forming around gig work. In Germany, the bulk of activities is still run by established trade unions, and they try to sort of give gig workers a forum and try to look out for them. But they're in real terms, there is much more rhetoric than actually happening on the ground, because it's very difficult to organize gig workers, because there's not much in it for them to actually join the union. So the unions are not strong on that field. But they are strong politically, and they have sort of the pushback against, and there's a lot of sort of political attention paid to the gig economy, and sort of policy making towards sort of regulating the sector has sort of moved on quite substantially over the last 6 months. So it's more a political discourse than a unionization discourse.
Well, can I thank you, Anke, also for answering so concisely, for providing a great perspective on what's happening, also talking, what's happening in Germany and other countries around the world. And can we all give Anke a big thank you very much. And hopefully, if anybody missed the last bit, you can catch up on it on Catch Up on Demand.